Mr Wilcock, I see.
My lady, I represent the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved Families for Justice, which exists to ensure that the voices and experiences of the COVID bereaved in Northern Ireland are heard and properly considered throughout this inquiry, and is, as your ladyship knows, made up of members who have lost loved ones, both old and young, to COVID-19. We adopt, but will not repeat, the submissions you have just heard from Ms Munro, King's Counsel. Throughout the preceding modules, we have sought to highlight a range of systemic and structural failings within the political and health systems of Northern Ireland that rendered it both so ill-prepared and ineffectively run to be able to properly react to a global health emergency. You have heard and will hear of the resultant pain and frustration of our members as they experience the impact of a chronically overstretched and ill-equipped health system run in the context of a political vacuum or repetitive instability. In terms of this module, however, the inquiry will want to scrutinise whether, although perhaps inevitably, Northern Ireland relied on the UK's greater scale, research capacity and purchasing power in terms of the development and supply of the COVID vaccines, its decision makers, scientists and representatives might have better participated at all stages in the development and supply of COVID vaccines, not least to ensure timely communication, but also to improve understanding and, by extension, to ensure that the needs of the people of Northern Ireland were fully considered from the earliest possible stage. Perhaps, just as in society as a whole, the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved Family for Justice has a range of different views on the issues being considered in this module of the inquiry. Many, most, perhaps a vast majority of our members share the commonly held belief that the development, regulatory approval, procurement and rollout of the vaccine was one of the comparative success stories of the response to COVID, and recognise that it is at the heart of the UK's ability to bring the pandemic under control. I say success story. However, our group doesn't see success in this context in absolute terms, measurable simply by comparing performance to that of neighbouring states. On the contrary, the approach we urge upon the inquiry is to examine whether the vaccine rollout could have been improved as far as Northern Ireland is concerned. And we suggest a number of questions may arise for consideration. 1. Given the early recognition throughout the world that only a mass vaccination programme was likely to provide a route out of the pandemic, did Northern Ireland act with sufficient speed and impetus to lay the groundwork for that rollout? In this context, the inquiry will note that there was no senior medical officer with responsibility for vaccines at the Department of Health in the run-up to the vaccination programme, a familiar refrain you've heard in other contexts in earlier modules. Indeed, it appears that significant operational planning and management of the inevitable mass vaccination programme did not take place until Patricia Donnelly was appointed head of the COVID vaccination programme on the 5th of October 2020. On top of that, the inquiry will note that in 2020, Northern Ireland was without a centralised vaccination management system, the VMS, and had no way of centrally managing or evaluating vaccine uptake or distribution. How could this be? When did those with responsibility note that significant absence and begin to react? What are the consequences of the fact that a VMS had to be developed in real time during vaccine development and rollout? Is it correct that the VMS was not fully operational and did not evaluate vaccine uptake until May 2021? These are Northern Ireland specific questions which your ladyship will want to consider. Once a vaccination programme became a reality, the inquiry might want to ask, did the Northern Irish administration and health sector devise the necessary means to ensure maximum uptake was achieved? And my lady, we say that if scope for improvement in any of the questions that the inquiry feels fit to ask in this question are identified, then the inquiry is enjoined to identify this in order to inform future responses when the next pandemic surely hits our shores. So what are the possible areas of improvement within the Northern Ireland context? Well, given the evidence the inquiry has heard in other modules, your Ladyship will not have been surprised to read in our written submissions and hear me repeat now that one area where the vaccine rollout most obviously could be improved lies in the collection and the ability to collect data on vaccine rollout and uptake, and whether this hindered the effectiveness of the programme in Northern Ireland and the ability to evaluate that effectiveness. And my lady will note that in the expert reports commissioned for the inquiry, Drs. Caston Dabouche and Dr. Chancellor highlighted that effectively the absence of data in this area meant that we rely almost exclusively on the self-report of the Northern Ireland CMO for any evaluation or analysis of the rollout. But, my lady, the disadvantages of not having timely access to detailed data of, at the very least, vaccine uptake, age, geographical coverage and ethnicity are obvious. In any mass vaccination programme, success depends on reaching the widest range and number of people. As we have set out in our written submissions, if vulnerable sections of the community are overlooked, then the potential for the virus to proliferate among them is clear, and the dangers to everyone who is unvaccinated is plain. And, my lady, in addition to the vulnerable groups that Ms Munro mentioned, as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, we ask the inquiry to consider particularly those who give unpaid or informal care and thus fall outside the protection professional care sector. The lady may have been surprised to read that in Northern Ireland they amount to some 12% of the population. 12% of the population providing unpaid care for those they love. Given the extremely high numbers involved, we suggest the inquiry should consider what impact the absence of a central carers register or any otherwise reliable individual data had on the vaccination programme in Northern Ireland. Did it hinder access to an appropriate priority group for the 220,000 potentially eligible individuals? What has been done about creating a carers register in the year since the COVID vaccination programme concluded? These are all Northern Ireland specific matters which we would ask you to consider. But, my lady, there is an overarching issue at the heart of this inquiry. And the inquiry will hear tomorrow from Fiona Clark, one of our lead representatives, who, like many of our members, is understandably haunted by the thought that, given AstraZeneca was approved in December 2020, had it been made available to her mother, Margaret Lusty, a few weeks before she received the first dose on the 7th of January, then she may not have contracted COVID on the 12th and died in the heartbreaking circumstances you know of in Antrim Area Hospital on the 17th of January. That is one example of the experience of our members, and it is an indication of Fiona's compassion and the generosity of spirit within the organisation that I represent, that despite her own experiences, including suffering long COVID, Fiona nevertheless acknowledges that although she personally did not know of anyone who'd been caused harm by the vaccine, she is aware of other members of our group who've had different experience and therefore concerns about the vaccine. And for that reason, she has drawn your attention to the case of William Wilson, who suffered organ failure after receiving the Pfizer vaccine. And thus, he, like other bereaved members of the group I represent, has a different experience of the vaccine rollout than perhaps Fiona Clark does, and the vast majority of our members do. And that experience requires us to ensure that the inquiry equally considers that concerns that the understandable desire for speed of mass vaccination was not over-prioritised over vaccine safety, and your Ladyship will, I know, be looking at that. Accordingly, in acknowledging the speed of the vaccine development and deployment between early March and December 2020, we simultaneously asked the inquiry to consider both whether preparedness could have been better so as to allow for even more rapid deployment, whilst, in the words of the written submissions of the Vaccine Injured and Bereaved UK, quote, not forgetting the uncomfortable truth for many that vaccine injury and death are also part of the pandemic story. And my lady, rightly or wrongly, there are those within our campaign and society at large who have deep concerns about whether the true picture as to the safety of vaccines was or is being imparted to the public. It is plainly axiomatic that confidence in the vaccine will only be diminished. It can only be diminished if information about vaccine safety is either inaccurately or not fully publicised. And that we applaud the inquiry's attempts to try and give a neutral analysis insofar as a legal inquiry possibly can on this issue. And, my lady, we are therefore grateful to Mr Keith, King's Counsel, for his outline of the UK clinical trial process and the post-authorisation surveillance of the vaccines that he outlined this morning. And all of our families look forward to the inquiry investigating the experiences of those within the vaccine injured groups and considering whether the evidence on vaccine safety was in fact sufficiently robust and sophisticated as we all in this room hope that it would have been. On a related subject, my lady will hear tomorrow that even though William Wilson, of whom I spoke a few minutes ago, suffered organ failure after receiving the Pfizer vaccine and spent a significant time in hospital, and I'm not using this because the inquiry can do anything about the individual case, I'm using it as an example of the issues that are being raised, that even though he suffered what might be thought extremely serious consequences and life-changing injuries, he was deemed not to meet the relatively high criteria of severe disablement or 60% disablement when he applied for compensation under the vaccine damage payment, which Mr Keith mentioned this morning. And, my lady, you will no doubt be looking carefully at whether this scheme remains appropriate in today's world, or whether the Vaccine Injured and Bereaved UK and other CPs are right to describe it as inadequate and inefficient. And Mr Keith, King's Counsel, was quite right to say this morning that a scheme which commands confidence is an important part of the system for countering what he called vaccine hesitancy, but which may more appropriately be called vaccine scepticism. And it's only if there is confidence in the compensatory regime that there will be full confidence in those issues. My lady, one aspect of the Northern Ireland experience of delivery is the consequence of Northern Ireland being a largely rural area. And, my lady, you will have read of the experiences of one of our members, Michelle Reid, whose father tested positive and he was eligible for the vaccine but was immobile and housebound and thus unable to attend his GP, and was told by the GP that at that time there was no mandate from the Department of Health to allow them to administer vaccine in his home. And Michelle and her family were not alone in this experience, and we asked the inquiry to consider whether sufficient consideration was given to ensuring access to the vaccine by those who were, for whatever reason, marginalised. In a future pandemic, reaching those who are unable to leave their homes, wherever they may live, must be done quickly and without bureaucratic hurdles. My lady, the group I represent is also concerned about the vaccine condition of employment issue, which Mr Keith raised this morning. You heard one view in the impact videos this morning from Anne-Marie O'Neill, but there are others. Many of our group questioned, for example, why in June 2021 the executive concluded that it was not necessary to make vaccination compulsory for care homes, and that family members and other visitors were required to be vaccinated before spending time in care homes with loved ones, whilst those caring for their loved ones around the clock were not, appeared to many of my members to be at best incongruous. And my lady will appreciate that although the effect of the pandemic on care homes is to be dealt with in Module 6, it is that issue which lay at the heart of the foundation of the group I represent. And we would ask Your Ladyship to consider the adequacy of the various public responses that are set out in the statement you will hear tomorrow. My lady, moving to a close, thus far I've only addressed the issue of vaccines. Plainly you will want to consider the issue of therapeutics. One complication of this issue is, of course, the word therapeutic means different things to different people depending on your knowledge of the issues involved. Your Ladyship will have read within the statement how many of the people I represent believe that their loved one did not receive the appropriate therapeutical treatment in relation to their care. Either way, we share the view of the clinically vulnerable families that it is important that the issue of therapeutics does not, quote, fall through the cracks. And we were therefore reassured by Mr. Keith's assurance that that will not be the case and his outline of the issues this morning. My lady, I come to a close. It's really this. So much to do, so little time. We ask the inquiry to apply its usual rigour to the evidence it receives in this module, and as far as Northern Ireland is concerned, to try and ensure that at the very least a more nimble and data-driven approach might be pursued in the likely event of another pandemic requiring mass vaccination. My lady, that's...
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Brooke. I'm very grateful. Ms. Mitchell-Casey.
I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. The Scottish COVID bereaved are once again grateful to play a part in ensuring that important and relevant questions are asked of our experts, our politicians, our scientists, to help obtain evidence to provide a basis for making recommendations. We thank Counsel to the Inquiry, Mr Keith Casey, this morning for a comprehensive and detailed opening statement which sets out a helpful framework for the Scottish COVID bereaved to understand the scope of this module and provide a blueprint against which we can proceed with obtaining relevant evidence. There are very many questions the Scottish COVID bereaved have about vaccines, and between this module and the next, we highlight the following 6. 1. What were the barriers to enable the rapid development and production of vaccines, and how were they removed? And what changes to systems and processes have been put in place since? 2. How was the vaccine rolled out in Scotland, including an assessment of who was eligible to obtain a vaccine as a key worker and who was not? 3. What lessons can be learnt from the rollout? Did we properly protect those most vulnerable by making sure they had priority access to vaccines when needed, especially those who had contact with hospitals and care homes, given what was known about hospital-acquired infection? 4. Was proper consideration given to the fact that large parts of Scotland are rural and island? Whether asking people to attend, for example, individually for vaccines was the best methodology? Whether vaccinating families might have assisted with uptake and minimise financial implications of long travel to get to vaccine appointments individually? Was vaccine hesitancy properly addressed? I note the phraseology used of vaccine scepticism, and that will be something given consideration by the Scottish COVID bereaved. Although vaccine hesitancy indicates a pause, vaccine scepticism may indicate a doubt, and there may be yet a third term which can encapsulate all those matters together. Was sufficient consideration given to meeting misinformation and challenging disinformation, debunking theories which had no evidential basis, particularly in social media? 6, was sufficient information given to people, particularly the vulnerable, about the possible effects of the vaccine? Behind these questions are people, families who have lost loved ones and want answers. These answers won't help protect their loved ones, but the answers will ensure that families in the future may better protect their loved ones, our loved ones. They want to know how we can best prepare our vaccine systems and procedures for disease X. In this module, we would urge 2 things. Firstly, that those who come to give evidence before this inquiry do it understanding that their answers ought to be given truthfully in a straightforward manner without agenda. Secondly, that the press who, in certain areas, have been critical of this inquiry, give proper consideration to how unwarranted criticism plays into disinformation narratives surrounding COVID and could undermine critical confidence not only in the recommendation process, but in relation to vaccines themselves. Recent events in the UK serve to remind how important the media and social media is in forming narratives. As the Scottish COVID bereaved made clear in Module 1 and continue to say, an attack on the work of this inquiry is an attack on the families who lost loved ones in the Scottish COVID bereaved group. As ever, we approach this module keen to help the inquiry to come to a view about the best recommendations possible to ensure any and all lessons that can be learned so that Disease X meets a population ready to roll out suitable vaccines, efficient and fairly. These are the submissions of the Scottish COVID bereaved.
I'm very grateful, Ms Mitchell. Thank you very much indeed. Mr Jacobs, are you back there somewhere? Oh, right in the corner. I don't know if you could get further away from me, Mr Jacobs. I don't think you're switched on. Is the green light on? No. I think the problem is getting you to the transcriber. Rob, okay, it's on it. Try again. No. I usually find kicking it helps, but I'm not recommending that. It's not my equipment. I was going to say, is there one? Are we confident that you're moving to one that works? I'm afraid audio today is... No.
Should I come first?
That's it.
I'm back.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appear for the Traveller Movement. We represent the Roma, Gypsy and Traveller groups. And Traveller Movement is a registered charity and the largest representative body engaging with these groups. Our CEO, Ms McNamara, will give evidence before you on Thursday. My lady, the GRT communities have been part of our society for at least 500 years. Sadly, they have always been and remain the subject of suspicion, hostility and marginalisation. Indeed, the first official recognition of their presence in England was the 1530 Egyptians Act, which sought to remove them from the country. In 2014, the Office of National Statistics found that the recorded number of GRT were likely to be seriously underestimated, and that there was evidence that there may be 300,000 GRT in the UK. Other sources put that number as high as 500,000. So, my lady, we say significantly this accounts for between 0.5 and 1% of the UK population. It's TM's primary position, as borne out by much of the evidence in this inquiry, that these communities were largely ignored in the Covid-19 vaccination programme. John McCarthy, an Irish traveller in his mid-60s, has asked us to convey his reflections, and he says, "It was a disgraceful abandonment. We were left to fend for ourselves, invisible to those who were meant to protect us. We've spent much time considering the evidence that has been disclosed by the inquiry in the build-up to this module, for which we're grateful. And we say that the following three conclusions have emerged from that evidence. Firstly, it appears that GRT were the highest unvaccinated group within the UK population. The inquiry's own experts have referred to a June 2022 report by Public Health Scotland, and the reference for that is INQ 000147517, and it's also referred to in Dr. Kassan Dabush and Dr. Tracy Chantler's report at paragraph 184, INQ 000474623, and that report shows that GRT were 55.1% unvaccinated. This is the only group for which over half of its population did not receive COVID vaccines. The same Public Health Scotland report confirms that traveller communities, when measured against 15 other minority groups, were shown to be the least likely to have received at least one vaccine dose. Secondly, the evidence from the University of Glasgow from August 2023 shows that the GRT population also faced a higher risk of hospitalisation and death from COVID than white Scottish groups. And thirdly, government and medical institutions knew about the problem of low vaccine uptake in the traveller communities, or ought reasonably to have known, we say. We have stated in our written submissions, which are before you, that well-regarded health journals such as the European Journal of Public Health and the BMC Public Health Journal said in 2017 and 2018, importantly that's 2 to 3 years before the COVID vaccination rollout, that there were a number of barriers to vaccine uptake in relation to travellers, which include discrimination and poverty. The traveller movements say that it should always have been obvious to government and medical institutions that the GRT communities would have difficulty in accessing vaccines. For example, and we stated this, you may recall, at the preliminary hearing in May 2024, around 10,000 GRT are forced to live on unauthorised sites as a result of failure by local authorities to meet their spatial planning duties. These people are unable to provide addresses to register with GPs or access the vaccine programme through medical authorities. And there is evidence from friends, families and travellers, a charity, to the effect that 74 out of 100 GP surgeries appeared to break NHS England guidance by refusing to register a nomadic patient in March and April of 2021. Furthermore, it's well known that GRT people face literacy and internet access issues, digital exclusion, and that made registering for vaccinations and attending appointments significantly more difficult. So it should have been obvious also that GRT communities were at higher risk from COVID-19 through their inability to self-isolate due to living arrangements. My lady, we say that above all, the primary barrier to vaccine uptake is the discrimination suffered year in, year out by these communities. And this discrimination directly feeds into levels of trust in the authorities. And marginalised groups, all marginalised groups, will necessarily take a more circumspect or sceptical view of the official messaging around vaccination than those whose lives are not blighted by discrimination. We highlighted at the preliminary hearing back in May that the experience of many travellers during the pandemic was, instead of receiving any guidance or assistance, their only interaction with the authorities took the form of heavy police presences at funerals in circumstances where the number of officers were often greater than the number of mourners. They were seen as problems for the law enforcement agencies and not as a vulnerable community in need of support and help. More recently, we've read in the evidence disclosed by the inquiry that critically ill travellers died because ambulances were not allowed onto traveller sites until the police had arrived to accompany paramedics. These are not isolated examples, and we understand from our client that there are many further examples of pandemic measures which exacerbated the very discrimination that has contributed so greatly to scepticism and low vaccine uptake. My lady, it's important for the inquiry to understand that there were solutions to the problems of vaccine hesitancy or scepticism, I'll adopt that term from earlier on today, in the GRT communities, and that these solutions were put forward prior to the vaccine rollout. We've referred in our written submissions to a study from the Journal of Public Health from July 2020. That's INQ 004-74820. It's entitled Improving Immunisation Uptake Amongst Gypsies, Travellers, and a Qualitative Study of the Views of Service Providers. Roma as well, sorry, I missed that. In that report, research was undertaken in 4 UK centres where 6 traveller communities were based. Those were Bristol, Glasgow, London and York. 39 service providers were interviewed and 4 major themes emerged from the evidence that had been gathered. Firstly, service providers in all 4 cities spoke about the importance of building trusting relationships with traveller families and the need to understand community concerns regarding specific vaccines. There was a need for individual care providers and face-to-face engagement, and specialist health visitors for our travellers were highly valued in all 4 cities for their strong relationships with families and knowledge of traveller culture. Secondly, it was reported that traveller families often were not registered with GPs, having a large family, and many children often increased difficulties with booking or attending appointments, and these factors led to lack of uptake of immunisation appointments. Thirdly, there were concerns raised, and this is an important concern, around lack of data collection on traveller ethnicity, such as GP practices not recording ethnicity at registration and child health information systems not recording this information. And starkly, even now, NHS systems do not include GRT ethnic categories for staff to complete. And fourthly, the 2013 NHS reforms in England, which resulted in responsibility for health protection and immunisation programmes being moved to Public Health England, then a new organisation, were regarded as having had a negative impact on the ability of service providers to improve uptake of immunisations in traveller communities. The consequences of those reforms included loss of organisational memory and led to reduced funding for awareness campaigns or staff training, and created a situation whereby specialist health visitor posts were sometimes no longer available. So the key themes are maintaining trust within the traveller groups locally, and specialist health attendances on GRT and high quality data. And the travel movement maintains that policymakers had no record or indeed interest of how many GRT there were in the UK, so no meaningful steps were taken to assist them, protect them or vaccinate them. My lady, it's a constant complaint by those who I represent that the GR communities are not visible. Even though the problems and potential solutions to GRT vaccine hesitancy and low uptake were known about prior to rollout, the GRT communities were effectively overlooked, and that's a situation that continues even today. Now, earlier this morning at 10:30 a.m, Mr. Keith, King's Counsel, in his opening submissions, took the inquiry to a document entitled Introductory Charts, Statistics on Vaccines, and slide 6 within the presentation shows 9 ethnic groups and the percentages of those groups who received 2 doses of vaccine. But there was no reference in that slide to GRT, even though, as I've previously stated, this group comprises 0.5 to 1% of the UK population and are recorded by Public Health Scotland as being the highest unvaccinated group, and the group that was the least likely to have received at least 1 dose. We can assume that GRT are represented in the any other ethnic group category within slide 6. My lady, when you come to consider that evidence and that slide, you will note it bears a strong resemblance to figure 5 in the report of Dr. Cassian Dabush and Dr. Chantler, which also excludes GRT and seems to only relate to England. You will also note that GRT was not recorded as a relevant ethnic group in the data recorded by the National Audit Office, which records 15 ethnic groups, many of which have an equivalent UK population to GRT. And the reference for that is INQ 00065228, see figure 21. The slide presentation will no doubt have been uncomfortable for my client watching this on the live feed, yet one suspects the reason for the omission of GRT in the inquiry's presentation is not of course, that the inquiry is disinterested in those who I represent, but that data collection in England was deficient insofar as GRT were concerned. And this is one of the many matters that we'd wish the inquiry to consider. We've noted with some regret that the evidence proposals of the witnesses don't touch very much on GRT issues, and we propose to address this, as we're entitled to do, of course, through the Rule 10 process. And we have submitted and will submit Rule 10 questions for every witness who may be in a position to answer questions relating to what steps, if any, government and healthcare institutions took to identify the size and location of the GRT population in any particular area, so as to ensure that this group was adequately considered during the vaccination programme. We've also asked whether what actions were taken to address the impact of the vaccination programme on the GRT community, whether government agencies and medical authorities worked closely with local authorities, for example, which held data on caravan sites, whether digital exclusion and literacy issues were considered, and who, if anybody, was charged with addressing potential vaccine hesitancy or low uptake in relation to this group. My lady, we accept that the timetable in this module might be somewhat demanding, but it's important that time is taken for the putting of these key questions to witnesses so that they can throw light on the failure of institutions to properly address the issues of vaccine hesitancy and low uptake by GRT in the COVID pandemic. My lady, to conclude, your counsel has told you this morning that the inquiry must examine what more can be done to overcome barriers to vaccine uptake, structural inequality of access, and the impact of misinformation. We say that the inquiry must look closely at the position of every minority group if it is to fulfil its TOR's terms. And the inquiry cannot disregard the Roma, Gypsy and Traveller groups simply because other institutions have done so and continue to do so. It's no longer acceptable that GRT remain invisible to policymakers. The reality is that the GRT communities exist in large numbers across the UK, and they suffer from the most extreme marginalisation, probably more than any other minority, in a number of areas, including from access to healthcare and, of course, access to vaccines. Finally, it is hugely important to my client that the inquiry takes all possible steps to ensure that the mistakes of the Covid-19 pandemic in relation to vaccination of GRT are not carried forward into any future pandemic or vaccination programme. That can only be done if the inquiry looks closely at the evidence in relation to this group and goes on to make robust findings and recommendations. Unless I can assist further, then those are my submissions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jacobs. I'm very grateful. Ms. Morris, I think you're over there this time.
Thank you, my lady. My lady, I, alongside Mr. Weaver, Mr. Mark Bradley and Mr. Wilcox of Hudgell Solicitors, represent three groups who together are recognised by the inquiry as the COVID vaccine adverse bereaved and reaction groups. These three groups are the UK CV family, the Vaccine Injured and Bereaved UK, and the Scottish Vaccine Injury Group. You will hear powerful evidence from Kate Scott, Charlotte Crichton, and Ruth O'Rafferty on behalf of these three groups during your inquiry. The thousands of people that these three groups represent present what is an uncomfortable truth for many, that vaccine injury and death are part of the pandemic story. These are men, women and children who are otherwise healthy, who followed public health advice and voluntarily attended to receive their vaccine. They include doctors, healthcare professionals, carers and parents who accepted the vaccine thinking not only of themselves but of their patients and those who they cared for. Those I represent are neither anti-science nor are they anti-vaccine. They are real people with real experiences. And my lady, this inquiry must recognise and acknowledge the real experiences of the vaccine injured and bereaved and their need for real treatment, real care and the need for real change in the way that vaccine injuries are reported and addressed. For too long, they've been ignored by the government, public health bodies and the media.
The COVID vaccine adverse reaction and bereaved are not just an unfortunate statistic or collateral damage to the government's vaccination strategy. They are individuals and families calling upon the health service and the government for urgent help. So, my lady, what does the inquiry need to understand about COVID vaccine adverse reactions and bereavement in this module? First, the inquiry must understand the decisions that were made around the production, regulation and rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines. The groups I represent question what was the so-called acceptable risk of the COVID-19 vaccines to them? And were those risks communicated in an effective way, which meant that members of the public were able to provide informed consent to vaccination? There was clearly a political drive for the UK to be seen at the forefront of global vaccine development, and we asked the inquiry to interrogate whether political pressure created an environment in which the assessment and the regulation of the safety of vaccines was not as robust as it should have or could have been, or whether a focus on vaccination meant the alternatives, such as therapeutics, were overlooked. We understand, for example, that the inquiry will hear evidence that the UK government agreed to pay AstraZeneca in advance for the supply of a potential vaccine, and that the government also agreed to indemnify them and the other pharmaceutical companies, such as Moderna and Pfizer, in respect of any losses from certain third-party claims. The purpose and the impact of this indemnification needs to be fully understood. Was this standard practice? Or was this a recognition by the government and the pharmaceutical companies that there was a safety risk in the development and distribution at such speed, which required special indemnification? The COVID vaccine adverse reaction and bereaved groups also want to understand the data available to the companies from their clinical randomised trial data and how this information was presented to the UK regulators. Where vaccines were scaled up from those tested in clinical trials, were the regulators presented with accurate safety data for the products that were in fact rolled out to the public? We also ask how did the MHRA and the JCVI scrutinise data, particularly with regards to those who commenced but did not complete the trials? Second, my lady, the inquiry must understand the post-rollout surveillance and monitoring of the vaccines. Although the desire for a vaccine at speed may have been understandable, the fast-track process for the development and rollout that followed meant that the stringent post-authorisation surveillance and monitoring was essential, as was public education and information on how to identify and report any adverse reactions to the vaccine. Essentially, the vaccine rollout put everyone in the UK in a Phase 4 post-authorisation trial. We were the real-world data that Mr Keith Casey referred to this morning. This made it imperative for the government and the NHS to ensure that there was an effective system in place that was well organised and signal sensitive to monitor, detect and treat any adverse effects. My lady, adverse reactions were to be entirely expected. As acknowledged by Mr Keith, King's Counsel this morning, any statistical probability on a population level of serious side effects such as thrombosis, thrombocytopenia, myocarditis, Guillain-Barré syndrome and other serious haematological, neurological, immunological and musculoskeletal injuries does not undermine their severity when they occur to individuals. Therefore, it must have been clear when rolling out the vaccine to millions of people, if the planning assumption was that 75% of the population were to be vaccinated, that there were likely to be vaccine-related deaths and serious vaccine injuries, however rare on a population level, that would require urgent identification, treatment and care. Many of us were vaccinated by our GP or our local healthcare provider. The BMA estimates that in England this was by over 70% of those vaccinated. We ask, were GPs also provided with sufficient information and training in relation to how to spot and report vaccine injuries? Many of us were vaccinated in mass vaccination centres and received multiple doses across different settings and from different manufacturers. We ask, were those who were vaccinated and vaccinating always advised of the latest information surrounding known risks? Was the patient information leaflet always up to date and available to those being vaccinated? Where changes were made to a safety profile, the inquiry must question whether public health messaging was early enough or clear enough in order that individuals could properly assess the risks to them. Also, was there a full understanding of whether multiple doses would impact of any risk of injury or further compound any existing vaccine injury? As Professor Stephen Evans points out in his written report to the inquiry, it could be said that safety is always provisional. in the sense that with rare events, it may take some time to be detected. The logic to this statement is that vaccine risk assessment and risk management must retain an open mind to the occurrence of adverse events. What Professor Evans calls the degree of an individual or a system's index of suspicion. Our groups question whether the UK government, regulators and the NHS had a sufficiently high index of suspicion to identify vaccine-related deaths and to treat vaccine injuries when they occurred. For example, given that it was known that there would be adverse effects from the vaccine, some of which might not arise immediately, why were the public and healthcare professionals not alerted to the possibility of delayed onset adverse reactions or the potential for adverse reactions that are of an unknown nature? My lady, you've heard from those in the Impact film, and you'll hear from the witnesses from the groups tomorrow who detail the experiences of those whose vaccine injury symptoms were dismissed, ignored and misdiagnosed, sometimes resulting in catastrophic escalation of the injury or, in fact, death. It is likely that much of the inquiry's evidence from the government and public health bodies will highlight the yellow card scheme and the additional yellow card pathway introduced for the COVID-19 vaccines as the most effective way of identifying adverse effects or safety signals. But medical and emergency staff should have been given training and directives requiring them to identify any conditions arising after vaccination and to immediately report them. This would have been crucial both for ensuring appropriate treatment and for collecting data on emerging side effects. For example, why was there no guidance stipulating that medical professionals should ask patients who attended hospital or a medical appointment with new symptoms whether they've been recently vaccinated, similar to the way in which questions are routinely asked about smoking, other medication and drug use as part of a standard health examination? Those in our groups have experienced disbelief and sometimes hostility by medical professionals when reporting their symptoms. Doctors and coroners have refused to accept that injuries or deaths were caused by the vaccine. Suddenly losing a loved one following a, quote, safe and effective vaccination is a massive trauma. Then being told that the cause of death is not related at all to the vaccine adds indescribable distress. Members of our groups continue to fight for the true cause of death to be recognised, leaving them unable to find closure over the loss of their loved ones. But we say the problem goes further than a lack of training or a lack of suspicion. The inquiry must have the courage to examine how the public messaging, narrative and the context of the vaccine rollout created a hostile environment for the reporting of COVID vaccine-related deaths and injury. The inquiry will recall the mantra, follow the science, from Module 2. In Module 4, our groups question whether that mantra and that mindset contributed to a culture of political and public pressure which dictated that vaccines were inherently good and that there would be no adverse reactions expected. My lady, scepticism and challenge are all valuable parts of scientific analysis, but sadly those within our groups were likely to be branded by those designing public health messaging as being anti-science or even anti-vax. The vaccines were consistently reported as safe, with members of the public being told in messaging, you must have them. Everyone's personal freedoms, ability to travel, go to work or to visit loved ones often depended on being vaccinated. The government also provided healthcare providers with financial incentives to maximise vaccinations within their communities. This must have contributed, even unconsciously, to a mindset that the vaccine must be delivered at all costs. The inquiry should be quick to identify any development of vaccine bias within healthcare settings which could have impacted on healthcare providers' ability to properly identify symptoms of vaccine injury. Within our groups, there are also numerous doctors within the NHS who had their own concerns about the vaccine, but were instructed to keep those concerns from the public, including their own patients. We should all find this form of cultural censorship deeply troubling. Thirdly, my lady, the inquiry must understand the stigma and censorship attached to the vaccine injured and bereaved and how that is preventing them from accessing the treatment and the care that they need. One of the biggest issues that they have faced up until this point is being stigmatised, discriminated against and censored when they've used their voices to speak about their experiences of bereavement or life-changing injury. Husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, sons and daughters who have been killed or severely injured by the COVID-19 vaccine. Each death or injury has placed considerable emotional and practical strain on families, with some members having to become carers, leave their jobs, lose their homes, rely on food banks and face many other devastating consequences. During the early months of the vaccine rollout, those who experienced adverse reactions found it nearly impossible to access information about the vaccine injuries in the mainstream media. When they were eventually covered, the stories were often framed with an emphasis on the rarity of such reactions, the safety of the vaccine, the millions of lives it saved. Having been disbelieved by healthcare professionals and ignored by the mainstream media, those injured or bereaved by the vaccine turned to each other for recognition and support. They used social media to connect with each other, share stories and express their grief. A poll of all UKCV family members revealed that 74% had been censored when talking or posting about their adverse reaction to the vaccines on social media. One member of a group posted his experience on developing blood clots and other debilitating symptoms following his vaccination. His post was removed and described as false and harmful. Unfortunately, this censorship has continued years after the pandemic and into our engagement with this inquiry. YouTube removed a video featuring my legal submissions to you, my lady, on the 13th of September 2023. And despite requests for a thorough review, YouTube cited a violation of its, quote, medical misinformation policy as grounds for removal. Given the speed and novelty of the vaccine rollout in the pandemic, the UK should have created an environment in which safety signals around adverse effects could be spontaneously reported and data collected. It should have been recognised that when the yellow card system was not able to capture all the signals, that social media was a rich source of information and support for those concerned that they were injured. Instead, the strategy seems to have been deployed in relation to posts about vaccine bereavement or injury was just simply to remove them from social media, to silence their voices. There does not appear to have been any effective attempt by the government or public health officials to use social media or even traditional media to meaningfully increase awareness of vaccine injury reporting schemes or to offer support and access to compensation for those who had suffered. Could a reason for the rise in trust of social media have been that people were able to find information about the adverse effects they'd experienced from the vaccine at times when government and official sources were silent on these matters? The psychological and emotional impact of those suffering from adverse effects of the vaccine, coupled with the silencing and discrimination against them, is likely to contribute to future vaccine hesitancy if not adequately addressed by this inquiry. Fourth and finally, my lady, the inquiry must urgently address the inadequacies of the vaccine damage payment scheme. The government knew at the time of the vaccine rollout that very rare adverse effects of Covid-19 vaccine will only be observable when there had been a large-scale rollout. Therefore, it was clear, we say, that there would have been a need for an efficient system to address vaccine injury that could satisfy the moral duty of the government to act in a way that was just towards individuals who suffered a disability or death as a result of engaging in a government-run health protection scheme. The COVID vaccine adverse reaction and bereaved groups are clear that the VDPS is not fit for purpose. Their calls for urgent reform have been supported by parliamentarians in both houses and legal academics. They have highlighted the moral and social duty, underscoring the VDPS, and underlined the fact that if there is no reform, there are likely to be significant implications for vaccine confidence, something that Mr. Keith King's counsel recognised himself in his observations to you this morning, my lady. The DHC itself acknowledged in its impact assessment for the expansion of the VDPS to include the Covid-19 vaccines that, quote, all citizens gain from the knowledge that the government would award financial assistance if they were severely affected. My lady, you will hear tomorrow some harrowing stories from those who've had to wait inordinate amounts of time to have their claims resolved, often only on appeal, causing significant and compounding further distress for them and for their loved ones when they need support the most. No one who has watched this morning's impact film can be left in any doubt of the level of distress that the VDPS rejection can cause to those who are vaccine injured or bereaved. Many individuals experienced severe injuries that required urgent and protracted medical treatment, sometimes taking months. It was only after this point that doctors would acknowledge or confirm that the injury was caused by the Covid-19 vaccine. Many of these individuals were only able to make an application to the scheme when they were well enough to do so. They then faced 18 months to 2 years of delays in processing their claim and receiving payment. Mr. Keith has touched upon the disablement criteria, but the notion of a 60% disablement criteria is not one generally recognised in UK personal injury law and is attributed to a pre-war pension scheme and industrial injuries. We agree with the evidence before the inquiry in writing from Duncan Fairgrieve KC that the current system is unfair, and we say it needs urgent reform. It must now be clear that reform is urgently required and the current system has not met the needs of the injured and bereaved. There have been promises made by the previous and current government to look at the VDPS, but here we are 4 years after the first vaccination and there has still been no action taken. My Lady, your inquiry, like the many others before it, will be judged on the implementation of its recommendations. The imperative for you, therefore, my lady, we say, is to assist the effective implementation, is to thoroughly investigate the evidence with a view to making urgent, clear and meaningful recommendations, we say via an interim report, combined with a robust monitoring framework to deliver the long-awaited support to those who have suffered and those who continue to suffer the adverse effects of the vaccine. This will not wait until 2026 or 2027. Action is needed now. Importantly, as Mr Keith acknowledged this morning, effective support and care for the vaccine injured and bereaved is inextricably linked to vaccine hesitancy. If the status quo is allowed to continue, public confidence in future vaccination programmes will be affected, as those that are asked to engage in vaccination can no longer have the confidence that there is any effective safety net for their physical, mental health or financial needs should they need it. In conclusion, my lady, of course, the groups I represent are grateful for being granted participant status in this inquiry, but our simple presence at this inquiry is not enough. What we trust the inquiry will hear loud and clear from these submissions and those we have made on previous occasions is that the voices of the COVID vaccine adverse reaction and bereaved will not be dismissed or ignored. Their experience with Every Story Matters and the report that's been produced has not given the vaccine injured and bereaved groups confidence that the inquiry has yet fully understood their lived experience. But we hope that Mr Keith's words this morning reflect the inquiry's ability to listen during these evidence hearings. The inquiry must now listen to their voices and reject the stigma that has so far been attached to their stories in order that the truth can be acknowledged. Only then can the inquiry propose meaningful change to benefit future pandemics. We raise significant questions and make substantive proposals, which we ask this inquiry to break with the failures of the past and demonstrate what can be achieved by way of recommendations when the bereaved and injured are listened to. My lady, those are the opening submissions on behalf of the COVID vaccine adverse reaction and bereaved groups.
Thank you, Ms Morris. Mr Freeman, I think you're next. Are you right? Ms Freeman, I appreciate that the likes of you, Mr Thomas and Mr Stanton have all moved from top right to back left. I've asked if arrangements can be made if everybody's agreeable. So for those of you who are likely to ask more questions and therefore need to be closer to me and to the witness to see if we can do some swapping around. So I appreciate it. Forgive me for the next 2 days, but that's the plan. Don't think so. No.
Yes,
yes, got
you can
you.
hear me now. Thank you very much, and thank you for what you just said, my lady. As you know, we act for Disability Rights UK, Inclusion Scotland, Disability Wales and Disability Action Northern Ireland. They are national disabled people's organisations, or DPO, run by and for disabled people. The inquiry is about to consider a narrative that the way in which government, science and industry carried out pharmaceutical interventions during the pandemic is something that the UK did well. Whatever value is placed on that narrative, for disabled people, it is complicated by a tendency to judge success by non-disabled standards. It declares how pharmaceutical interventions allowed society to reclaim its normality without sufficiently acknowledging that there is a plurality of different norms or appreciating the features of the endeavour that were problematic for disabled people. As we set out in written submissions, the problems that disabled people encountered with vaccines were foreseeable, but too often overlooked because of the way government works. This has adverse implications for disabled people, especially for prioritisation and accessibility of the vaccines, as well as profound and continuing exclusion for a sizable part of the population for whom vaccination was not a medical option. Starting with foresight. As the inquiry has established in its Module 1 report, due to long-term failure to plan, the system of government, including the resilience of its health and care sector, were deeply vulnerable to a pandemic. For disabled people, the position was one of distinct precarity, And government knew that was so, not least because they had been repeatedly warned as such by domestic and international DPO and human rights bodies. For reasons that the DPO have articulated across different inquiry modules, government is not set up well to give forethought dynamically to the interests of disabled people. But by the late summer of 2020, the foreseeable consequences of the pandemic for disabled people's mortality, morbidity, and social exclusion were unavoidably demanding of recognition. Statistics counted disabled people as 6 out of 10 COVID fatalities. Death rates of those with learning disabilities were 30 times higher for younger people. Disabled people were profoundly isolated without access to care or at risk from catching COVID from their carers. This was the context in which government rushed to find pharmaceutical solutions, but with awareness of its considerable shortcomings in planning and capability to protect disabled people. There is indeed a particular moment, we suggest, when the disconnect between vaccine planning and disabled people's marginality might have come into focus. It was October 2020, when Michael Gove, as the chair of the COVID-0 meeting, alerted departments by letter that, quote, time was running out for disabled people for the second wave, and that fundamentally more ambitious programmes were needed. The Disability Unit of the Cabinet Office responded in November 2020 with proposals, and we say the date is relevant. First, a data commission to, quote, understand the factors driving increased mortality risk. Second, a national panel for disabled people to, quote, create a channel to hear voices of lived experience and feed these into government's COVID policy. And third, a national centre for digital access to, quote, improve digital accessibility for disabled people. All these proposals, my lady, were essential, practical means for a targeted and effective rollout of vaccines to disabled people being planned there and then, but none of the proposals were developed. What my lady is about to see is a consequence of their actions. Which brings us to the role of the government. DPO used the social model of disability to reflect the extent to which much of the experience of being disabled is socially determined. As this inquiry progresses, it becomes clear that the social model is important as a method for evaluating government decision-making because, one, policies tend to be designed to accommodate non-disabled people, causing recognition of disabled people to be an afterthought. And two, disabled people are underrepresented in government, not prioritised in the structure of government machinery, and consequently made politically vulnerable in their capacity to influence the production and design of policy. The problem was no less relevant to vaccines and therapeutics. With matters which are repeatedly described in the statements and the exhibits as, quote, clinical and medical, there was even greater risk that consideration of disabled people would be limited to consideration of medical conditions. This is not criticism of medical science or the necessary role of experts in decision-making. But without social considerations, questions of risk categorisation and prioritisation were treated as ethically neutral and essentially a matter of natural science, when these matters are far more complex. Neither is the creation of a pharmaceutical product and the prioritisation of different cohorts the sum total of a successful policy. Whatever cohort a disabled person was in, vaccination needed to be accessible to them. The DPO's criticism in this module is that government failed to engage disabled people at each stage of its pharmaceutical interventions, from development to prioritisation to delivery and accessibility. And the reason why that happened is because government is not structured, educated, or culturally committed to work that way. Problems came to the fore because vaccine prioritisation decisions, particularly in phase 1, were not informed by the social model and ethical reasoning did not play a significant role at all. In consequence, the rollout of vaccines initially failed to prioritise disabled people, especially those under 65 with learning disabilities, when prioritisation was due because of what was known about the risk of premature death to that category of population. Even when cohort 6 was expanded to include those categorised as having, quote, severe and profound learning disabilities, change was made without acknowledging that there is no generally accepted definition of this term. It was not consistently coded on the GP and other databases, and learning disabled people and those caring for them do not necessarily self-define that way. In addition, prioritisation categories did not fully embrace the care system. While there was consensus that frontline health and care workers needed to be vaccinated early, what was not recognised early enough is that the frontline labour force for disabled people overwhelmingly comprises unpaid carers, informally employed carers, and personal assistants who are not necessarily registered anywhere or identifiable by reference to deployable data held by the DWP or local authorities. As a result, disabled people who lived at home faced invidious choices about continued support by unvaccinated assistants. Conversely, if their carers also worked in care homes, they could sometimes be vaccinated long before the still shielding disabled person that they cared for. The approach to prioritisation was also not ethically robust because its laudable concern to save lives did not appreciate the triple jeopardy that disabled people faced during COVID. Not only one, that disabled people could die from the virus, but two, they could die or be seriously diminished in life expectancy because of lack of access to other healthcare or services. And three, they could otherwise experience inhumane levels of social isolation when confined to their home or if vaccinated carers were not able to safely access them. My lady, there may be counter-arguments, and I'm not trying in a short speech to rewrite a policy, but what is apparent on current disclosure is that this type of ethical discussion did not take place in government in a structured and transparent way, and it certainly did not take place with the involvement of DPO. Instead, the JCVI decided at the outset that it would not consider ethics. In practice, ministers deferred to their advice. Government resisted the moral and ethical advisory group's suggestion that there should be a published ethical framework. And that ethics group did not scrutinise the JCVI approach to prioritisation at any time until March 2021. Which brings us to the problems with accessibility. The DPO emphasised the need to think through accessibility from start to finish, from how to reach out to someone to become vaccinated, to what journey they will make to the site, what will happen there, and how they can be supported in their decision-making. What instead occurred was the operation of multiple barriers affecting communication, appointments, physical and environmental accessibility, all of which could have been avoided if policies were co-designed with disabled people. To mention just two areas. First, physical and environmental barriers for disabled people existed in accessing vaccination sites, with difficulties in leaving home at all without assistance, thereafter in reaching the sites and entering step 3. Once in the environment of the centre, there were queues and waiting, various risks of sensory overload, and for deaf people, the combined problem of no BSL interpreters and staff wearing opaque face masks. Second, disabled people who were cautious about taking a new and relatively untested vaccine enjoyed far less accessible information and communications to support them in both their decisions and the practicalities of getting vaccinated. There should have been heightened emphasis on accessible and effective communication from initial contact, followed up with supported decision-making, and an opportunity to understand the implications, if any, of the vaccines for pre-existing conditions. what disabled people got was singular formats for letters, briefings without BSL interpretation, deaf or hearing impaired individuals receiving phone calls, letters without braille were sent to those who were visually impaired, booking processes predominantly comprised online systems when it was known that disabled people were less likely to have essential digital access skills or internet access. In any event, websites were often not high contrast. There was inadequate, easy-to-read versions or telephone options for those unable to book online or who otherwise wanted support or further discussion. Our final point concerns those disabled people who, for reasons of being immunocompromised, either could not take the vaccine or for whom the vaccine would not be fully effective. We are told that this could be over 1 million people who have not been able to return to normal life and are still shielding. The incompleteness of the research and ethical discussions about the urgent need for alternative kinds of prophylaxis, such as antivirals and monoclonal antibodies, is one of the problems of everyone else, so to speak, returning to their normality. For the DPO, the situation is neither smart nor kind. There is no certainty that vaccines will work for any of us next time round, but until then, the political will of the crisis and the heightened market incentives for big pharma have gone away, and a sizable part of the disabled population have been consigned to exclusion. My lady, when pandemic inequalities became a major political issue, as they did later in 2020, disabled people did not enjoy significant recognition in that politics. New structures and policies were brought into being, but disabled people were not empowered as the co-designers of planning for the second wave and the vaccine rollout. The Disability Unit and the Minister for Disabled People could not be relied on to amend the policies in the design stage, and neither could anyone else in government. For the next pandemic, establishing why this was so and how things could be different is probably the most important thing this inquiry could do for the now 16.1 million disabled people in this country who make up 24% of its population. The module is an important case study. What many disabled people experienced was a relatively non-negotiable set of options with little agency in design and delivery, and a burden on DPO and others in devolved nations and the third sector to correct deficiencies after the fact. This is not how government claims it wants it to be. But after several modules of evidence, one must ask how to describe a system that causes patterns of repeated disadvantage on a widespread scale to a particular group of people. An unavoidable word for that system is discrimination. What to call this aspect of the way disabled people are governed is important, not because we are in a court of law, but because the inequalities of the pandemic response were not inevitable. They require more open and adequate reckoning with the choices involved and the changes that need to be made. Once again, the inquiry is about to see why.
Thank you very much indeed for your help, Mr. Friedman. I'm very grateful. That takes us conveniently to 3 o'clock, and I'm particularly grateful to all the advocates who are keeping to timing so beautifully. I shall return at 3:15. All rise. Mr. Thomas.
Restful break.
Yes, you I can hear you now, sorry. So it's restful break, did you say?
Yes, I did.
Thank you.
My lady, as you know, I represent FEMHO. The time is always right to do what is right. These words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. deeply resonate today, reflecting one of the most pressing and moral, practical challenges of our time, ensuring that no one is left behind in healthcare. These words remind us that in moments of crisis, doing what is right requires urgency, courage, and clarity of purpose. You see, milady, as this pandemic tore through our healthcare system, not caring who it touched, its heaviest toll fell on those who were already marginalised. We've said it before, and it bears repeating. The first 10 doctors to lose their lives to the Covid-19 were from the Black, Asian, or ethnic minority backgrounds. This is of no coincidence. It's a harrowing testament to the systemic inequities ingrained in our healthcare system. As we've examined in the first 3 modules of this inquiry, these disparities are not isolated. They are entrenched. It is both unsurprising and deeply troubling to see this same thread woven into Module 4 on vaccines. For members of FEMHO, these numbers are not abstract statistics. They represent colleagues, friends, family, who were the backbone of the pandemic response but bore the heaviest burdens of risk, illness and death. Our members, standing at the intersection of race and healthcare, lived these realities daily. They are uniquely placed to illuminate not just what went wrong, but why it went wrong, and to share learnings as to how matters may be improved from both their professional and lived experience. Module 4 on vaccines provides a crucial opportunity to ask bold questions and draw meaningful lessons. Were vaccine strategies designed with equity at their heart? Did they tackle mistrust rooted in systemic racism? Did the government meet its obligations to dismantle barriers, or did it inadvertently deepen them? You see, we approach this inquiry with both the weight of the past failures and the hope for a future that learns from them. FEMHO is here to assist in ensuring that the mistakes of this pandemic are not repeated and that reforms we pursue are bold, inclusive and lasting. Milady, FEMHO is not simply here to highlight failures. We hope we are here to drive solutions. Our members being professional and bring professional expertise and their experience that it will illuminate what went wrong and how we can ensure that these mistakes are not repeated. Let me come to a main theme, trust and communication. You see, trust is the foundation of any successful public health strategy. Yet, during the pandemic, it became a fault line. Trust is not an intangible concept. It's the bedrock of public health. Yet, during the pandemic, trust was systematically eroded for many minority ethnic communities, not because of their reluctance, but due to institutional failures to engage with them meaningfully. Trust simply cannot be assumed. It must be earned through transparency, cultural sensitivity, and consistent engagement. You see, it's crucial to understand that the challenge was not simply about communities being reluctant to accept vaccines. Instead, the failure lay in how these policies and initiatives were communicated, or I should say, inadequately communicated to them. For ethnic minority communities, trust in public health policies was already fragile. eroded by decades of systemic inequalities and underrepresentation. And Milady, I pause there and come off script just to note the impact video that we saw this morning with the doctor touching on this very issue with members of her community. The pandemic only deepened this divide, from the perceived lack of transparency of safety and the expedited approval processes, misinformation spreading unchecked, to poorly communicated vaccine policies. We saw the devastating impact of a failure to engage communities in ways that resonated with their lived experience. The problem, as I say, was not a lack of willingness, but a lack of trust in the system, often overlooked or undervalued these communities. For example, the absence of culturally competent communication left many ethnic minority individuals alienated and uncertain. Simple yet critical concerns, for example, are the vaccines halal? Do they contain alcohol in the ingredients? Conflicted with other cultural practices which was not adequately addressed in the initial rollouts. This failure contributed to what has been described as vaccine hesitancy, not out of defiance, but out of a lack of trust in the system, which seemed blind to their needs. This module offers an opportunity to reframe the conversation. This module must confront the reality that trust cannot be built retrospectively. The lesson here is clear. Inclusive communication strategies that actively engage communities are not optional, they are essential. Building trust requires active listening, culturally sensitive outreach, and communication strategies that are informed by and designed in partnership with the communities they seek to serve. Rebuilding trust is not just a moral imperative, it's a public health necessity, and it must be a continuing process. Let me turn to the next theme, structural inequalities and data gaps. Systemic inequality isn't just a historical wrong. It is a present and persistent barrier to equity in healthcare. Nowhere is this more evident than in the glaring and long-standing issue of the lack of diversity in vaccine trials. During the pandemic, clinical trials for the major vaccines showed a shocking underrepresentation in minority ethnic groups. For example, over 90% of the participants in the AstraZeneca trials were white. For the Pfizer vaccine phase 3 trial, almost 83% of the participants were white. And the figure is almost 80% for the Moderna phase 3 trials, thus leaving significant portions of our population unaccounted for when assessing the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. This oversight reflects not just a failure to prioritise diversity, but also a failure to uphold basic principles of equity in science and medicine. Equally troubling is the persistent data deficit that plagued decision-making during the vaccine rollout. Ethnicity-specific data, which could have been a vital tool for identifying disparities and tailoring interventions, was either absent, incomplete, or inconsistently collected. Without it, governments and healthcare systems were flying blind when it came to understanding the unique vulnerabilities and barriers faced by ethnic minority communities. This failure contributed to the inequitable rollout, where pre-existing disparities in healthcare outcomes were not just perpetuated, but in some cases exacerbated. Vaccines as a condition of deployment. The introduction of vaccines as a condition of deployment was, on the face, a policy aimed at protection, but it was poorly communicated and, in practice, disproportionately burdened ethnic minority healthcare workers, the very people who carried out our healthcare system through the crisis. This policy was a blunt tool which erroneously overlooked the historical and cultural barriers to vaccine uptake in these communities, compounding workforce challenges and deepening divides. The lack of engagement and consultation with staff exacerbated concerns and fostered a culture of fear and coercion. Safety surveillance and the yellow card scheme. The yellow card scheme was intended as a safeguard, a mechanism to ensure vaccine safety and build public confidence. Yet, for many ethnic minority communities, it became yet another symbol of mistrust. How could they have faith in a system that, for many, unknown, and for others, barely understood? The lack of proactive measures, such as providing options in multiple languages, utilising local pharmacies and community leaders, and raising awareness and communications about how the scheme worked, particularly around addressing adverse reactions, left a vacuum of misinformation readily filled. You see, if we're to rebuild trust, such schemes must be transparent, accessible, and embedded in culturally competent outreach that resonates with all communities. Next theme, vaccine confidence. Vaccine confidence is not a measure of individual trust, but reflection of systemic effectiveness. The barriers that undermine vaccine confidence and uptake among ethnic minority communities were not born in these communities. They were the product of government failure to meet them where they are, in language, in culture, in shared trust. And we submit that, given the data and existing knowledge from previous vaccine programmes, a lower uptake and confidence levels amongst ethnic minority communities ought to have been anticipated and mitigated against from the outset. Misinformation spread like a second pandemic, milady, preying on historical mistrust and amplifying fears. Communities already marginalised by systemic inequities found themselves left behind by public health messaging that failed to resonate or address their legitimate concerns. For example, cultural fears, as I've already indicated, about the ingredients. Accessibility also played a critical role. Vaccine sites and public health campaigns often fail to cater for non-English speakers or adapt their messages to cultural norms and values. Culturally sensitive outreach was often an afterthought rather than an embedded practice, compounding existing hesitancy and leaving those most vulnerable without clear and trusted information. I've nearly finished, Milady. I just want to move on for some lessons because I want to be forward-thinking. Lessons for future preparedness. As we consider the lessons of Module 4, one truth becomes undeniable: our preparedness for future pandemics. It must look profoundly different from the past. Equity cannot be an afterthought, it must be a foundation. The preparedness plans must embed equity as a core principle, ensuring that diverse voices are present where at every table and where decisions are made. Milady, let me leave you with a vision. Imagine a healthcare system where every vaccine developed and deployed is a testament to fairness and equity. A system where clinical trials reflect the rich diversity of our population, ensuring that vaccines are tested and proven effective across all ethnicities, ages and backgrounds. Picture a vaccine distribution strategy that not only reaches every corner of our communities, but does so with sensitivity and cultural competence. Envision a public health campaign that resonates deeply because they're co-created with communities they serve. Messaging that's delivered in languages that people speak, addressing their fears, their concerns, and delivered by leaders they trust. Imagine a vaccine centre designed to accommodate cultural needs, where accessibility is not a hurdle, but a given, where misinformation is drowned out by a chorus of trusted, inclusive voices. In this reform system, vaccine confidence flourishes not because it is demanded, but because it is earned. Trust is built through transparency, inclusivity, and respect, ensuring that no community is left behind. This is the vision we must collectively strive for a healthcare system where inequities of the past are lessons for a better, more just future where vaccines are not just life-saving, but trust-building tools for every individual, regardless of their background.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Thomas. As ever, very grateful. Now I think it is Ms. Knight, King's Counsel. Yep.
Yes, we're on now. Thank you, my lady. We represent Doctors of the World, the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, the Kanlungan Filipino Consortium, and MedAct, who formed a collective in this inquiry known as the Migrants Primary Care Access Group. And during the pandemic, those organisations, through their collective knowledge and experience, emerged as key experts on the health consequences of Covid-19 for migrants in the United Kingdom, given their years of working with and supporting migrant communities in health and migration policy. And in our Rule 9 statement, to which Anna Miller from Doctors of the World will speak tomorrow on behalf of all 4 organisations, we clearly and without doubt identify barriers to vaccine delivery and healthcare inequality that prevented access to the Covid-19 vaccine and therapeutics for a significant proportion of migrant communities. Well, in real terms, what that means is that some migrants contracted COVID and died as a direct result of failure by government to address and dismantle those barriers that prevented them from accessing the vaccine on account of their immigration status. Barriers which the government knew about from the outset and which had been deliberately put in place to deter people from coming to the UK and remaining here. And despite public health requiring those barriers to be removed in the context of this unprecedented health emergency, they were maintained. This evidence shows that immigration policy was prioritised and continues to be prioritised over public health to the detriment of all of us. And what's crucial to highlight at the outset is that the independent expert reports commissioned by this inquiry, and to which Mr. Keith Casey identified this morning on disparities in vaccine coverage and vaccine hesitancy, overwhelmingly corroborate our evidence by identifying that the same persisting barriers to vaccines for migrants exist as an obstacle. The government's failings exacerbated those pre-existing inequalities in healthcare access and outcomes, which without doubt led to avoidable illness and death amongst migrants. Many migrants occupy an intersectional space as both being Black, Asian and minority ethnic individuals, and of course being amongst the most socioeconomically deprived, to which other core participants have spoken today, including Ms. Munro Casey and Mr. Thomas Casey just now. The statistics with which Mr. Keith opened this morning clearly show that there was a demonstrably lower uptake of the vaccine amongst all ethnic minorities. But that is not the whole story, and it's the task of this inquiry to scrutinise the reasons why, and in particular how and why, immigration status was a factor in that unequal uptake. We know from your ladyship's initial report in the Preparedness and Resilience of the UK from Module 1 that the government's approach to risk assessment was fundamentally flawed and that the planning focused on dealing with the impact of the disease rather than prevention. And this included a failure to appreciate the range of people who might be vulnerable in a pandemic. When those conclusions were examined in the context of this module, the government's failure to adequately plan for vulnerable groups is stark when considering the impact on migrants in relation to the vaccine. Migrants as a class feature a disproportionate number of individuals who faced both increased exposure to contracting COVID-19 and an increased risk of experiencing severe symptoms and fatalities caused by the virus. And as such, they were deserving of particular care and consideration in government planning to facilitate access to the vaccine and to prevent individual harm, and in the interests of wider public health. They didn't get it. Instead, they faced significant and interwoven barriers to access, embedded by decades of immigration policy, structural racism, and socioeconomic inequalities that all contributed to deep-rooted mistrust of authorities and an inability or reluctance to access healthcare during the pandemic. But the most pernicious barriers to vaccines and healthcare were government-created, specifically designed to enmesh access to healthcare with immigration control. They include the NHS charging regime and data sharing practices between the NHS and the Home Office. Those barriers and the harms they cause to public health were well known and well documented prior to the pandemic. For years, experts in the field, including the 4 organisations that we represent, called on government to remove those barriers to protect wider public health, but those warnings went unheeded. And although we acknowledge the government did take some reactive and short-term action during the pandemic, for example, by adding Covid-19 to the schedule of exemptions from NHS charging, the evidence is unequivocal. The measures were ineffective and failed for being too little and too late. The fear and mistrust caused by the long-standing hostile environment policies cannot be switched on and off in times of natural emergency. The only evidence-based and credible recommendations to ensure effective and meaningful removal of those barriers to healthcare in the interests of wider public health, including vaccine uptake, both now and in future pandemics, is for those hostile environment policies to be permanently repealed. From a public health perspective, anything less would be ineffective. So ultimately, prioritising the saving of lives of all individuals in the UK, regardless of race and immigration status, is the only way to effectively protect us all. And discriminatory denial of access to healthcare harms everyone. Our clients would like to highlight the following 5 governmental failings from our opening submissions and witness statement, which we won't repeat in detail. Our recommendations derive from those core propositions. Delays or refusing to implement the changes that we propose until we're in the midst of a future healthcare crisis will be too late and would once again put migrant lives and consequently all of our lives at risk. First, there's an ineffective approach to exempting Covid-19 from NHS charging. The NHS charging framework is extraordinarily complex and frequently misunderstood and misapplied by NHS trusts. And this results in migrants being denied healthcare, erroneously charged for healthcare, and or pursued for unpaid debts that they cannot afford. From late January 2020, the government included Covid-19 as an exemption from healthcare, from NHS charging. However, from that time and to date, charges continue to apply to treatment for long Covid or other health complications caused by the surrounding NHS charging regimes, and there was no clarity as to what might be charged and chargeable and what was not. Throughout the pandemic, NHS staff, Royal Medical Colleges and migrant organisations formed a unified voice in calling for effective action to suspend the most harmful exclusionary healthcare policies, but those calls were ignored. Second, the data sharing. The NHS is required by law to share information with the Home Office on patients' immigration status and unpaid hospital debt. And this, unsurprisingly, has caused many migrants to view the NHS and healthcare workers with suspicion, fear and profound mistrust. It was well known and long recognised by the Department of Health and Social Care that data sharing between the NHS and the Home Office deters many migrants from accessing healthcare due to fear of immigration enforcement action. During the pandemic, many who feared such personal data being shared avoided accessing the vaccine. And critically, at no stage during the pandemic was there a data sharing firewall implemented between the NHS and the Home Office to reassure migrants. And that refusal to respect patient confidentiality on grounds of immigration status is a serious public health concern with serious consequences. Third, the vaccine access model was based on a model that directly excluded the most vulnerable and at-risk migrants. The government's approach to vaccine invitation and booking only captured those with an active GP registration and an NHS number. The issue of GP practices routinely refusing to register migrants, including on account of their immigration status or lack of documentation, was widely reported and well known to government prior to the pandemic, yet it persisted unaddressed. As a result, when the pandemic struck, many migrants didn't feature in primary healthcare records and they didn't have an NHS number. Belated government efforts to communicate that vaccines could be administered without such a number were inadequate. Fourth, there was a clear failure to identify or prioritise migrants in high-risk settings. Despite the urging social distancing and isolation, the government procured several former military barracks as asylum accommodation sites, where overcrowding in shared facilities significantly increased exposure to the virus. But at no stage did the government identify or prioritise these sites as being high risk and eligible for vaccine priority. And the evidence suggests that this was on account of it being politically unpalatable. And again, this was a failure to put public health first as a priority over immigration policy. Fifth, there was a failure to collaborate with specialist frontline migrant NGOs and consider their recommendations. So even where barriers to access to healthcare and in turn vaccine uptake were repeatedly identified, and in particular by our clients, the government failed or refused to take the necessary and timely action that evidence showed was necessary to seek to ensure access. So, my lady, this inquiry now presents a pivotal and critical opportunity to make robust, evidence-based recommendations that restate the fundamental and inalienable right to equality, dignity and access to healthcare for all. The importance of ensuring the universality of access to healthcare has never been more vital when addressing the issue of vaccine delivery and barriers to uptake. The impact of the government's deliberate policy choices and the preoccupation with immigration undermine the health and safety of the entire population. Public health at its widest, and in the context of a pandemic, hinges entirely on achieving widespread and inclusive vaccine uptake. One of the express overarching stated terms of reference of this inquiry is to consider any disparities evident in the impact of the pandemic on different categories of people, including those relating to protected characteristics under the Equality Act 2010. And in Module 4, one of the terms of reference is specifically, of course, to examine unequal uptake, the potential causes of such unequal uptake, and the government response. The evidence before this inquiry demonstrates that the Covid-19 pandemic, during that, the government persistently failed to address the fundamental question necessary to design and implement effective interventions aimed at ensuring equitable access to the vaccine, namely, what were the root causes of the barriers to vaccine uptake by migrants? This question was simply not properly posed or considered by key government departments, and therefore, those barriers and health inequalities were significantly widened as a result, as the statistical evidence clearly demonstrated. This failing was squarely identified by the inquiry's own experts for Module 4, to which Mr. Keith referred this morning in the Castan, Debuche and Chantler report on vaccine delivery and disparities in coverage, which identified that national policy, and particularly immigration policy, had an adverse impact on vaccine delivery strategies during the pandemic. And this strongly underscores and reinforces our client's central position advanced to this inquiry. Although the hostile environment policy agenda and overarching legislation was introduced by the Home Office to deter migrants, the NHS charging regime now sits squarely within the remit of the Department of Health and Social Care. They laid the regulations underpinning the charging regime, and they are responsible for its operations. But key elements of the charging regime remained fully operational throughout the pandemic, including data sharing provisions that mandate the NHS to undertake immigration checks with the Home Office and report unpaid hospital debt directly to the Home Office. None of the key decision makers in the relevant central government departments, including Matt Hancock and Sajid Javid, the former ministers for the Department of Health and Social Care, Nadine Zahawi, the then vaccine minister, Kemi Badenoch, then Minister for Equalities, has identified or referred to, either by name or in substance, the NHS charging regime or the data sharing as barriers to vaccine delivery or uptake, or at all. And the very narrow reference to the historic suspension of data sharing by the Home Office in their witness statement fails to address the ongoing data sharing between NHS and Home Office under the charging regime throughout. The government, we say, failed cross-departmentally to address the impact of those policies on migrant access to healthcare. This wholesale government omission is stark. Failure to acknowledge even the root causes of those low uptake obviously means that the barriers could not be and were not mitigated or removed. At best, this is a failure by those departments to identify and address the impact of the hostile environment immigration healthcare policies. At worst, it amounts to a willful and deliberate reluctance to prioritise public health over immigration control, even during a national emergency. The failure to properly identify those barriers is deserving of criticism from the inquiry, commensurate to the harm and the risk of harm it caused. And if maintained, this approach will cause such harm in the next public health emergency. The Department of Health and Social Care now, in their opening written submissions to this inquiry, acknowledge that more could have been done, and earlier, and that there's much to be learned with respect to tackling inequalities in relation to ethnic minorities. But there's no reference to migrants as a subset, and no reference to the impact of immigration policy. So in closing, we say, my lady, that this necessitates robust recommendations from the inquiry that restate the priority of public health over immigration policy as a clear lesson to be learned. As Council's inquiry stated, the inquiry must focus on identifying the most significant systemic features to identify what needs to be embedded or improved. And in line with your ladyship's recommendation from Module 1 for radical reform, we invite the inquiry to make bold and impactful overarching recommendations. And by adopting those recommendations, the inquiry will send a clear and committed message that truly every story matters, and by ensuring that everyone, regardless of their immigration status, will have access to the healthcare that they need. Thank you very much, my lady.
Thank you. Very grateful. Mr. Wagner.
Good afternoon, my lady. I act for clinically vulnerable families, which I'll refer to as CVF. I act together with Hayley Douglas, who sits to my left, and Lamisa Iqbal, and I'm instructed by Kim Harrison, who sits to my right, and Shane Smith of Slater and Gordon. CVF is a grassroots organisation born of the pandemic, and it represents the clinically vulnerable, the clinically extremely vulnerable, the immunosuppressed and their families. The first issue I will address is vaccines versus therapeutics. CVF remains concerned that although the inquiry has said Module 4 will examine vaccines and therapeutics in parallel, as is in the Module 4 list of issues, the examination of therapeutics will ultimately fall through the cracks. In the 10 weeks of hearings in Module 3, despite therapeutics apparently being split across the two modules, the topic was barely mentioned in oral submissions. We are grateful for the indication by Mr. Keith KC this morning that non-vaccine medicines were also a critical part of the response to the pandemic, and this module will be focusing on therapeutics, non-vaccine medicines, with the same degree of scrutiny as it will be focusing on vaccines. We really are grateful for that indication and trust that will allay our concerns. But we do identify that a number of witnesses, for example, Dame Kate Bingham, have said to the effect of, I do not know why a different approach was taken to vaccines on the one hand and therapeutics and antivirals on the other in relation to the pandemic itself. And CVF makes an overarching submission that the lower prioritization of therapeutics and prophylactics very likely cause serious damage and cost lives. And that's why we've said a number of times it's important that the inquiry doesn't repeat that mistake, but we do appreciate the indication. Prioritization and eligibility and communications, and I'm referring to issues in the issues list. Clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable people were rightly amongst the first to be vaccinated, but many of CVF's members reported confusion around their eligibility for priority vaccination. There were clinically extremely vulnerable people who were not automatically called for vaccination because they had not been recorded as clinically extremely vulnerable. Many more clinically vulnerable people who were not clinically extremely vulnerable were never officially identified and were therefore left doubting their own eligibility. Without the knowledge that they were eligible for priority vaccination, clinically vulnerable people were understandably less likely to advocate for themselves. And CVF are concerned the result was that clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable people were simply not aware of their status or not aware enough, and therefore didn't receive the protection of the vaccine as early as they should have. We urge the inquiry to investigate how that played out in the early months of the vaccine programme. Our next topic is vaccination of children. This is important to CVF because of 2 points. First, the impact on clinically vulnerable children who are at higher risk of severe outcomes of Covid-19, of not being able to access the vaccine. And secondly, the impact on households That is, non-clinically vulnerable children who lived with clinically vulnerable parents or siblings or household contacts. CVF was concerned by the slow rate of expansion of the Covid-19 vaccination programme to children. So for clinically vulnerable families, there was a very long delay between the rollout of the vaccines to adults in December 2020 and the eventual vaccine offer of, to healthy 12 to 15-year-olds in September 2021 and to 5 to 11-year-olds even later in February 2022. And we say this had a detrimental impact on those families. It led to some CVF members who could afford to travelling internationally to get vaccines for their children. The vaccination has never been offered to healthy children under 5 years old, despite other vaccines being offered to that group. CVF submits that the decision-making around the vaccination of children was too cautious, too slow, and out of step with the approach taken by other countries. And we also say that the JCVI's singular focus on the potential risks from the vaccine versus the potential benefits of the vaccine to the individual child was too narrow. We say more about this in our written submissions, but essentially we say they should have taken a broader view, looking at not just the impact on the children, but the impact on their families of the children not having access to the vaccines, particularly in clinically vulnerable households. And once the vaccine was eventually offered to 12 to 15-year-olds in September 2021, CVF members experienced difficulties in actually accessing the vaccine for their child. And we submit that it's likely that delays in decision-making around children, combined with discouraging language and communication used once the vaccines were approved for children, in stark contrast to the language, the positive language used for adults, contributed to the lower uptake amongst children. Our next issue is barriers to vaccine updates, and particularly accessibility to vaccines. This has been mentioned by a number of core participants this morning, such as the disability groups and others. A significant feature of the initial rollout of the Covid-19 vaccine was the use of large vaccination centres, which were often not safe for clinically vulnerable people to attend. CVF are concerned that patients who were eligible for vaccination didn't come forward or didn't obtain a vaccination as early as they could have done because of their valid concerns about the risks of such centres. For example, there was often severe overcrowding, a lack of vaccination, poor air quality in the buildings used, as well as staff and others regularly removing their masks. And this is simply not fit for purpose during a pandemic involving an airborne virus. And clearly there had to be a balance between what was available and what was achievable. But we do say in terms of future planning that needs to be thought through more carefully for an airborne pandemic. And this is reflected by the inquiry experts, Dr. Caston de Bush and Dr. Chandler, who say that mass vaccination sites were not always suitable and possibly not safe for a number of vulnerable cohorts in the JCVI prioritisation list, including people in older age groups, clinically extremely vulnerable, and people who had physical or learning disabilities. And this was, of course, in addition to the risk of contracting COVID-19 if you had to travel long distances to get to the vaccine centres, which for some people was the reality. That meant using public transport or being driven by someone who was potentially infected. Next, I want to talk about therapeutics. We do not, with respect, entirely agree with Counsel to the Inquiry's statement that, like the vaccine programme, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests the therapeutics programme was a success. Helen Knight, the Chief Executive of NICE, said in her written evidence that the system as a whole would need to do more to develop therapeutics for the highest risk patients in the event of another pandemic. CVF invites the inquiry to investigate why it took until October 2021 for a procurement decision to be taken on oral antivirals, with the first patients receiving treatments in December 2021, 1 year after the vaccine rollout began. Was this because of insufficient or unequal priority being afforded to the programme for therapeutics as compared to vaccines? And we asked the inquiry to consider whether a better approach could be adopted in future. Eligibility. CVF is concerned that the list of people eligible for therapeutics has been and continues to be particularly limited, especially given the underlying conditions and age profile of the people admitted to hospital and sadly dying of COVID-19. And we submit there should be an urgent rollout to those identified as eligible by NICE a year ago in January 2024 who have no access to the therapeutics to date. That 18-month delay until summer 2025, when the drugs will apparently be available, leaves vulnerable people exposed to unnecessarily high risks, including during, of course, the current quademic during the winter of 2024. Deployment. Sajid Javid, amongst others, emphasises in his evidence that the entire focus of the procurement of antivirals was to help those in high-risk groups, and particularly for those who could not be vaccinated but were still at particular risk or would not achieve the results of vaccination that others would achieve. But despite the importance, the COVID-19 antiviral pathway was and remains to this day fraught with issues about access and barriers which have prevented many vulnerable people from receiving life-saving treatment they need. It's significantly more restrictive compared to other medications like influenza antivirals, which can simply be prescribed by a GP. And many vulnerable people to this day are still not aware of their eligibility for those antivirals. Professor Nicholas White has told the inquiry in his written evidence that antiviral drugs were most effective as soon as people felt ill or were diagnosed with COVID-19 in the community. But in practice, the burden has been on the patient, who has to go through a series of administrative and bureaucratic hoops to get those antivirals. And we detail that in our written submissions. Finally, on the inquiry issues, non-vaccine prophylactics. For those who are immunosuppressed and unable to mount an effective response to vaccination, prophylactic treatment was in effect their vaccine. You could take it in advance before you got the virus, and it would help you. But there were very significant barriers, again, to receiving those treatments. There'll be some evidence, and Mr. Keith Casey has already referred to Evershed. But in short, we agree with Dame Kate Bingham's conclusion on the decision not to approve Evershed. By far, she says, the most significant harm was caused to hundreds of thousands of immunocompromised members of the UK public. The effect was the UK was the only Western country not to protect its immunocompromised people using long-acting antibodies. It was very plausible that this decision cost lives and condemned many more people to suffer through long-term shielding, and we agree. Before I conclude, I want to make a brief point about the impact film. We appreciate your statement, my lady, about the impact film not being evidence and not representing your ladyship's views, and we, of course, accept that. We also know how hard the inquiry team has been working on every aspect of this module, including the film, no doubt having to balance many, often competing perspectives. However, the impact film is an important piece of public communications, and any films produced by the inquiry should be produced carefully to ensure accuracy, proportionality, and representation of the issues identified by the expert witnesses to this inquiry, who have all now reported. That approach helps to reduce the risk of spreading misinformation or disinformation, which is crucial for safeguarding public health. The film, in its final form, was 14-minute long, and it devotes as much time to people who say they or their relatives suffered adverse reactions to the vaccine as those who gave a positive perspective. Only just over 5 of the 14 minutes are devoted to the positive impact of the vaccine. Another 2.5 minutes features those who were bereaved by COVID, but it doesn't make clear what the link, if any, of those stories has to the vaccine. One of the purposes of this module is to identify what went wrong with the vaccine development and rollout. And this includes listening to people who had adverse responses to the vaccine. CVF entirely supports that. Their voices are as important as others who have suffered as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, CVF's membership group includes a small number of people who were vaccine damaged. But thankfully, and as Mr. Keith Casey very clearly pointed out this morning, this is a relatively small group of people compared to the tens of millions who took the vaccine and had a good outcome. The tens of millions who were protected from the worst impacts of Covid-19, including many clinically vulnerable people. CVF's concern, and I hope that this is taken in the constructive way it's proposed, is that the impact film focuses too heavily on negative views. And members of the public watching may reasonably get the impression that a significant majority of people who had negative vaccine experiences, which would be wholly the wrong impression. As you will be aware, COVID-19 has been surging this winter, and the vaccination programme is and remains central to protecting people against that surge, as well as for many other viruses such as flu. But meanwhile, the ONS reports that around 1 in 20 adults, 4%, report negative sentiment towards the coronavirus vaccine. The inquiry, as a highly trusted public authority, with good reason, has a duty to ensure it does not even inadvertently encourage a disproportionately sceptical view of the vaccination. And one of the immediate negative impacts of the curation of this film was that 2 clinically vulnerable people withdrew consent to be in the video and had to be edited out at the last minute, which led to almost no mention being made of the 2 key focuses of this module, antivirals and therapeutics.
I'm sorry, Mr. Wagner, I'm going to stop you there. It was not the inquiry's fault that the clinically vulnerable people who had contributed withdrew, and they withdrew with very late notice, which left the inquiry with very little option to produce the film that it did. And I have already acknowledged there may be those who consider that it wasn't a fair reflection of the experience of the UK population. So I'm sorry, I don't take these criticisms of the inquiry in the constructive way you say. It was forced upon us.
Well, they would probably say it was forced upon them, my lady, and I don't speak for them because they're not my clients, but that's all I can say on that. Look, to be very practical, I finish here, we request that the inquiry consider, before it posts the video online, adding context by way of text or additional footage in order to ensure the film does not have the negative public health impact we fear it will. To conclude, CVF's concerns are linked by a common theme that the clinically vulnerable were often overlooked or their needs underappreciated when it came to the response to COVID-19. In this module, this is clear from the comparative lack of focus on antivirals and therapeutics, which are crucially important for the clinically vulnerable people as compared to vaccines. It's for these reasons that CVF considers it's essential that the clinically vulnerable are identified as a specific group or protected characteristic under the Equality Act 2010 and the inquiry's Equalities and Human Rights Statement to ensure that they receive the vital protections that they deserve and that they can no longer be switched on and off at the whim of public officials. CVF is grateful for your care and attention throughout this important module.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Ms. Monaghan, I think you're going next, aren't you, because you have a plane to catch?
Yes, my lady. Good afternoon. Thank you very
You are
much.
hiding.
I'm behind the column,
Yeah, don't worry,
my
I
lady.
can see you on screen.
My lady, I make this opening statement on behalf of Northern Ireland's Department of Health, which I'll refer to in the course of my submissions as the Department. At the outset of Module 4, the Department would like to emphasise that its overriding priority during the pandemic was always to protect the population of Northern Ireland, to minimise the loss of life, and to support all efforts to contain the spread of the virus. The loss of life and the individuals and the families who were affected must remain, we say, at the forefront of everyone's thoughts throughout this inquiry. And to that end, my lady, the Department would like to offer its sincere condolences again to all of those who were bereaved as a result of COVID-19 and extend its sympathy to the wider public who suffered as a result of the effects of the pandemic. The Department recognises the grief caused by COVID-19 is an ongoing matter and its effects are still being felt by many individuals as well as by the wider health and social care system. Equally, my lady, the Department would like to thank those who responded to the pandemic. That includes, of course, those who worked in hospitals, care homes and the community, members of the charity and the volunteering sector, staff in the department and throughout all of the Northern Ireland civil service. We would also like to wish to acknowledge the efforts of those who volunteered and participated in clinical trials of drugs and vaccines from those trials from which so many others, both in Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, benefited. Ultimately, it was only through the effective treatment and the Covid-19 vaccination programme that our path out of the pandemic was provided, and we were able to gain the normality with which we had previously been so familiar. It is undoubtedly the case that the link between infection and severe outcomes was progressively weakened by the identification and development of effective drug treatments and vaccines. These factors created the circumstances in which Northern Ireland could move away from the need for our non-pharmaceutical interventions and the more restrictive measures, and so limit the damaging impact to the health and well-being of the population and wider society. The Department is grateful to the Expert Scientific Advisory Committee, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, that's the JCVI, which advised the 4 UK health departments throughout the pandemic on all matters relating to vaccination, including eligibility and prioritisation. While the Covid-19 vaccines have been effective in helping to protect us all, especially those considered most at risk from the impact of the virus, we acknowledge that unfortunately, in some rare cases, individuals may have been injured as a result of vaccination. As with all medicines, vaccine side effects need to be continuously balanced against the benefits in preventing illness. To this end, we fully support and appreciate the work of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, who continue to closely monitor and review the effectiveness and impact of the Covid-19 vaccines. This work, we consider, is necessary to ensure that the benefits of the vaccines continue to outweigh any possible side effects. My lady, despite the Northern Ireland health and social care system already being under severe pressure prior to the pandemic, the collaboration of all of those involved ensured, in our view, the successful implementation of a vaccination programme. It was only through the collaborative and collective effort which was required and was supported by dedicated clinicians, public health professionals, scientists and academics that we were able to achieve such success. Their tireless endeavour, whose work in the trial, development and rollout of effective drug treatment and vaccines undoubtedly, in our opinion, saved many lives. In Northern Ireland, much innovation and many challenges were addressed both in the rollout of the Covid-19 vaccine and in the new Covid-19 treatment programmes through collective commitment and the collaborative approach taken by many. And to name just some, we cite the primary care general practice teams, the community pharmacies, the health and social care trusts, the Public Health Agency, the Health and Social Care Board, patient representative groups and professional bodies and organisations. The department worked tirelessly to develop highly productive and effective relationships with a wide range of stakeholders. We include trade unions, care home providers, schools, local government, sports bodies, businesses, etc. It's important also, in acknowledging those local sectors, to emphasise the significant collaboration and coordination across the United Kingdom in the rollout of Northern Ireland's programme at all levels, which included, of course, the collective efforts of the 4 senior responsible officers and their teams. This approach, my lady, of joint working facilitated, in our opinion, a solution-based approach to the many inherent challenges that arose. Joint working permitted the department to offer access to routine health and social care treatment and support services, as well as other public services, whilst at the same time rolling out an entirely new vaccination programme. This was possible notwithstanding the challenges inherent in the new protocols and procedures and the significant logistical challenges which were occasioned by that vaccination programme. Those same challenges arose again when the new Covid-19 drug treatments were identified in clinical trials. the Department reacted to the imperative to rapidly translate the findings of those trials into clinical guidelines, protocols and access pathways for those who were most likely to benefit. The Department reacted quickly to adapt and change the guidelines as new data and information became available. The reflection, my lady, in all of this is that while there were no easy or straightforward answers or solutions to many of the challenges, the collective endeavour of all ensured that through research, innovation and operational logistics, the delivery came together in what was an unprecedented national and Northern Irish effort. The Covid-19 vaccination programme was the largest and most challenging vaccination programme in the history of the Northern Ireland Health Service. The first Covid-19 vaccine was administered in Northern Ireland on the 8th of December 2020, and within 1 year, almost 3 million doses had been administered. That figure has now risen to over 5 million doses as we continue to follow the advice of the JCVI and offer the vaccine to those who are currently considered by it to be most at risk. The vaccination delivery model in Northern Ireland was designed to be flexible. GPs administered the majority of vaccines, with community pharmacy teams and HSC trusts playing extremely important roles in making the vaccine readily available throughout Northern Ireland. Mass vaccination centres came into operation at an unprecedented speed, and health and social care staff adapted quickly to change and reorganise at pace to deliver that programme. This programme saw leisure centres and other facilities converted to mass vaccination centres, which administered more than 1.5 million doses between them. Together with GP and community pharmacy teams, these centres helped protect and save the lives of many people in Northern Ireland. My lady, deployment of novel vaccines was complicated by the unique challenges posed by the physical characteristics of the vaccine products, including storage at ultra-low temperatures and restrictions on transport and handling. In the early days of the programme, the Department worked collaboratively with the Medicines Regulator, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, to ensure practical solutions were devised to enable the programme to be rolled out, whilst at the same time complying with medicine regulatory requirements and the relevant summary of product characteristics, as approved by the relevant medicine regulatory bodies. Additionally, the Department ensured the programme continued uninterrupted by working closely with the Vaccine Task Force, the UK Health and Security Agency and the MHRA to identify and address any potential issues which may have arisen from regulatory divergence between Northern Ireland and Great Britain due to the introduction of the Northern Ireland Protocol on the 1st of January 2021, which we were concerned could have potentially impacted our vaccine rollout. The Department has discussed how Northern Ireland was unique amongst the UK countries in that it is the only part of the United Kingdom with a land border with an EU country, namely Ireland. As a result, there were several issues that Northern Ireland had to address that other UK nations did not. The vaccination programme in Northern Ireland, for example, was launched several weeks before a similar vaccination programme began in Ireland, whose initial rollout was slower due to vaccine availability constraints. My lady, with regards to new therapeutics and the repurposing of existing medications, much detail has been provided on the role played by the Department in these developments. This includes the Department's role in the deployment of Covid-19 therapeutics to vulnerable groups, including those deemed clinically extremely vulnerable. The Department has fully supported the role of the MHRA in post-approval monitoring and surveillance of Covid-19 therapeutics, including for side effects and changes in effectiveness due to the evolution of new variants, and has encouraged professionals and the public to report any suspected adverse effects to the MHRA by way of the Yellow Cards scheme. To conclude, my lady, of course this opening statement can only allude to the level of detail that has already been provided to your inquiry in preparation for this hearing. We have provided numerous documents and witness statements which have been lodged by several key professionals. We hope, my lady, that the evidence submitted by the Department illustrates the work involved to implement the COVID vaccine programme in Northern Ireland. The Department recognises, of course, that the inquiry is uniquely placed to identify learnings and recommendations that should help shape future responses. It is for these reasons that the Department places the utmost importance on this inquiry. As such, the Department reiterates its firm commitment to the inquiry and stands ready to assist in any way that it can. Given, of course, the potential for another pandemic, it is essential, in our view, that lessons are identified and fully learned across health and social care and in all parts of government, both in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. Thank you very much, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Monahan. Very grateful. Mr Stanton.
Thank you, Melody. The opening statements of the British Medical Association is as follows. The BMA views the Covid-19 vaccination programme as one of the biggest successes of the pandemic response, in large part due to the immense efforts of doctors, particularly GPs and their practice teams, the wider healthcare workforce and volunteers. The unprecedented scale of the vaccination programme saved millions of lives globally. A study by the World Health Organization of 54 countries in the European region found that those countries that implemented vaccination programmes early, such as the UK, saw the greatest benefit in terms of numbers of lives saved overall through vaccination. And the authors of this report estimate that COVID-19 vaccinations in the UK reduced mortality by approximately 70% in adults aged 25 and over, which is among the best outcomes across the European region. Vaccination also changed the context of the pandemic and allowed governments to move towards reopening society as COVID-19 became less of a risk for most of the population. The BMA proactively made the case in England that the COVID-19 vaccination programme should be delivered by GP practices, given their expertise in delivering vaccinations, such as the annual flu vaccination programme, their proximity to local populations, and their ability to respond to any concerns regarding vaccination. By the end of October 2021, 71% of vaccines in England had been administered by GPs and their teams and community pharmacies, compared with 21% by vaccination centres and the remaining 8% in hospitals or other settings. And this significant contribution, which is well in excess of planning assumptions, was made alongside the delivery of other COVID and non-COVID care. GPs also made significant contributions in the devolved nations. As of spring 2024, 47% of vaccines in Northern Ireland had been delivered by GP practices. In Wales, where health boards were responsible for the delivery of the vaccination programme, there were nevertheless some 51 GP practices involved in the delivery of vaccinations by July 2021. And in Scotland, where over 2/3 of all vaccine doses were delivered using either mass or community vaccination centres, general practice administered the second largest proportion of doses at approximately 13%. GPs were also involved in efforts to increase vaccine uptake amongst their patients, and many GPs personally contacted individual patients from at-risk groups to encourage uptake. However, despite its success, the vaccination rollout was not without its challenges. The pre-pandemic understaffing of health services, as well as the pressures of the pandemic and insufficient consideration given to workforce planning, meant that GPs and their teams were required to work even longer hours while already overstretched to deliver the vaccination programme and maintain non-COVID and COVID care in parallel. These pressures resulted in medical professionals reporting stress, burnout and fatigue. For example, a GP from Northern Ireland who reported, "We have been stretched so thin covering COVID centres and also delivering vaccine programmes. This has had a huge impact on our staff." Issues with the vaccine supply chain also presented a challenge for vaccination delivery. Calls for improvement to the vaccine supply chain were made at various stages of the programme, and the BMA raised concerns that the approach to delivery and availability of vaccines had created uncertainty amongst GPs and healthcare teams regarding what they were able to provide to their communities and when. Regarding prioritisation, the BMA's position was that those most at risk of illness or death from a COVID-19 infection, together with frontline healthcare workers, should be prioritised for vaccination. Frontline health and social care workers had a far greater risk of exposure to infection due to their work caring directly and intimately for patients with COVID-19, and it was imperative that doctors and other frontline staff be protected so they could continue to provide these services, particularly in the face of a severe workforce shortage. However, there were differing experiences across the medical profession during the rollout, and groups that reported particular difficulties in accessing vaccination included resident doctors, GP locums, and doctors working in private practice. There were also indications of vaccine hesitancy amongst some healthcare staff, and in July 2021, research published by UK REACH found that healthcare workers were more likely to be vaccine hesitant if they were younger, female, pregnant, or had already experienced an infection. The research also found that healthcare workers from ethnic minority backgrounds were more likely to be vaccine hesitant than their white British colleagues. The BMA strongly urged doctors and frontline healthcare workers to be vaccinated, and uptake was high amongst doctors. For example, results from a February 2021 BMA survey found that, at the time, 93% of respondents had received the first dose of the vaccine. However, the BMA voiced concerns about the policy put in place in England that made vaccination a condition of deployment among staff in older adult care homes, and the proposed expansion of this policy to the wider health and social care sector, not least because it led to the loss of significant numbers of care home sector staff and exacerbated the existing workforce crisis. The BMA's view was that vaccination should be voluntary, based on the principle of informed consent, being respectful of individual rights and liberties, and that any move away from the existing voluntary model would need to be properly justified and proportionate. The BMA's priority was to support doctors and other healthcare workers getting vaccinated while listening to and addressing any concerns that staff may have, emphasising that vaccinations are safe and effective in protecting against the disease. In the general population, while the overall uptake of the vaccine programme was also high, the BMA expressed concern that progress was not equal across the UK, and that an overall high rate of vaccination masked significant disparities in uptake, particularly along the lines of deprivation and ethnicity. Lower rates of COVID-19 vaccine uptake among some people from ethnic minority backgrounds were seen across the UK and throughout the different stages of the vaccination programme, again with vaccine uptake highest amongst those from a white ethnic background. Disparities in vaccine uptake were also seen along deprivation lines. As referenced in the BMA's fifth COVID-19 review report, data from 2022 showed that across England, Scotland and Wales, vaccine uptake was higher in areas of greater affluence and gradually decreased along deprivation lines. Pregnant women were also another group which had needs that were not sufficiently met in relation to the vaccines. Changing government advice led to confusion amongst those who were pregnant about whether they should be taking the vaccine. This confusion should have been avoided, as pregnant women were at higher risk of severe disease from COVID-19. There were also concerns among people who were considering pregnancy, fueled by misinformation about the vaccine adversely impacting fertility. The BMA believes that more could have been done to identify the needs of vulnerable and minority groups ahead of the vaccine programme's delivery, particularly in light of the well-known pre-existing health inequalities and knowledge that vaccine uptake was lower in marginalised and minority groups, not least because of a history of structural racism. This significant disparity in uptake cannot be ignored, and the barriers to vaccination must be addressed if the UK is to be prepared for any future pandemic. In the BMA's view, there were several key barriers to uptake of the Covid-19 vaccine. First, there were physical barriers to accessing vaccination sites, such as difficulties reaching the sites. For example, some vaccination centres were a considerable distance from people's homes or workplaces and could not be accessed via public transport routes. The cost of transport, as well as having to take time out of work to travel, were also issues, especially for those on lower incomes. Accessing the vaccine was also challenging for those who were unable to leave home easily, such as elderly or disabled people, and for those who were clinically vulnerable, many of whom had an understandable fear of leaving home and catching Covid-19. Second, not having an NHS number became a barrier to vaccine uptake for many people in the homeless population, as well as for vulnerable migrants. And despite there being no need for a fixed address to access the vaccine, there were reports that some people still faced this barrier. Third, communication barriers for people who could not understand or access all the relevant information about having the vaccine, for example, in a linguistically or culturally appropriate way. Fourth, a significant cultural barrier among some ethnic minority communities was a lack of trust in health services and, by extension, the vaccine. People from ethnic minority and deprived communities also had worse health outcomes before the pandemic. And with this in mind, and as already mentioned, there should have been greater consideration of these groups when planning the vaccine rollout. Fifth, misinformation about COVID-19 vaccinations and anti-vaccination messaging in the press and on social media also likely added to vaccine hesitancy, and the BMA called on the UK government to take more action to tackle misinformation online. Finally, a discrete issue that the BMA wishes to raise within this opening statement is to rebut the criticism that it sought to take commercial advantage of the vaccination scheme. This offensive and unfounded criticism is based on a mistaken view that GPs had sufficient spare capacity within their existing workloads to deliver the largest and most complex vaccination programme in the country's history, right in the middle of a national health crisis. The reality was that the vaccination programme was additional work that general practice, already stretched to breaking point, delivered in the national interest, but which necessitated existing staff working significant numbers of additional hours and the engagement of additional staff, all of which needed to be paid for. Despite these challenges, vaccinations administered by GPs were delivered at significantly lower cost than the planning assumptions made and at significantly better value than at vaccination centres. The strain placed on general practice at this time was made clear by the BMA in a letter to government in September 2021, stating, "There are simply too few GPs and practice staff in under-resourced premises to meet the huge surge in demand that practices are currently experiencing, which will be exacerbated by the COVID vaccination booster programme. It will be GPs and their practice teams who will be leading this additional work. Given the magnitude of delivering millions of vaccines over the coming months, together with the increased patient demand during winter, it is vital that the public are made fully aware of just how much strain practices are under." My lady, in conclusion, and as outlined in this statement, while the vaccine rollout was an undoubted success, it was not without the need for improvement. The BMA invites the inquiry to consider the inefficiencies within the supply and delivery of vaccines around the country, to reflect the strain that the vaccination programme placed on general practice and the healthcare workforce, to acknowledge the detrimental impact on the workforce of vaccination as a condition of deployment, and to make recommendations that address the disparities in vaccine uptake and access to healthcare more broadly, which the BMA says requires urgent improvement by governments across the UK. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Dixie, I think you've got difficulties tomorrow, is that right?
Yes.
Mr. Mingo, can you be back tomorrow?
Yes, that's no problem.
That's no problem for you?
Yes, I can be here tomorrow.
That's really kind of you, thank you, because I think for the stenographer it's been quite a long afternoon and a long day for many people. So if it suits you, Mr. Dixie, as it obviously does, we'll take you next. I don't think you're switched on.
There we are. My Lady, I make this opening statement on behalf of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. The MHRA welcomes the opportunity to take part in Module 4 of the Covid-19 inquiry to ensure that its role and actions are fully understood and to play its part in supporting the inquiry to make findings and recommendations which will ensure that the United Kingdom and global community are better prepared for future pandemics. At the outset of these submissions, the MHRA wishes to publicly record its condolences and sympathies to all those who were affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, and in the immediate context of Module 4 of this inquiry, the MHRA wishes to publicly acknowledge its profound regret that anyone should have suffered adverse effects in association with receiving a COVID-19 vaccine or therapeutic. The MHRA recognises the serious suffering faced by those who now live with long-term injuries and by their families. No vaccine or medicine is without risk, and the MHRA is committed to finding out as much as possible about those risks and to ensuring that no effort will be spared to further strengthen its systems to identify and to act to minimise risks, however rare they may be. It is, however, important to acknowledge the many deaths which were prevented as a result of the COVID-19 vaccination programme. It has been estimated from the 1st of January to the 8th of December 2021, COVID-19 vaccines prevented between 14.4 million and 19.8 million deaths from COVID-19 in 185 countries and territories. And by September 2021, it was estimated that the UK vaccination programme had prevented over 20 million infections and over 100,000 deaths. The inquiry will also have in mind the extraordinary context in which unprecedented decisions and actions were taken. The authorisation and subsequent rapid and wide-scale deployment of COVID-19 vaccines prevented the loss of many thousands of lives and allowed the UK and the global community to return to some degree of normalcy much quicker. My Lady, as you've heard, the MHRA is the UK's regulator for medicines, including vaccines and therapeutics, medical devices and blood components for transfusion. The MHRA is responsible for ensuring their safety, quality and efficacy. Its mission is to enhance and improve the health of millions of people in the UK every day through the effective regulation of medicines and medical devices, underpinned by science and research. The inquiry will hear from the MHRA's Chief Executive, Dame June Rain, who has provided a detailed witness statement. In summary, and by reference to the provisional list of issues in Module 4, the MHRA was involved in the development of COVID-19 vaccines, including through the authorisation of clinical trials, the authorisation of such vaccines, post-marketing surveillance of those vaccines and communication of the results of that surveillance to clinicians, the public and others, and to the development, clinical trials and authorisations of therapeutics. The MHRA is not responsible for procurement or deployment decisions. In respect of the latter, decisions on which vaccines and medicines were deployed and who might receive those vaccines and medicines, those decisions were taken by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, or the devolved health authorities. The pandemic was a profoundly challenging time for everyone, including for those public servants who were at the forefront of the national response effort. Traditional ways of working were adapted, including by the MHRA. As is well known, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine was the first vaccine for COVID-19 that was authorised for use by the MHRA and was the first vaccine against COVID-19 authorised worldwide. In subsequent weeks, regulators in other jurisdictions followed suit, with no significant differences in terms of their approvals. It was administered in the UK on the morning of the 8th of December 2020, a pivotal moment. As of December 2023, the MHRA had authorised 9 vaccines for use against COVID-19, with a further 4 strain-adapted vaccines. 6 new medicines were authorised for COVID-19, with 2 previously authorised therapeutics approved by the MHRA to treat COVID-19. The MHRA adopted a number of regulatory flexibilities that were crucial in facilitating these approvals, and this included the rolling reviews of data as and when they became available. None of these flexibilities compromised the rigour of scientific scrutiny of the evidence of safety, quality and efficacy. The MHRA's scientific standards remained unchanged and were in line with international equivalents. An understandable focus of much of the evidence in Module 4 will be on the safety of COVID-19 medicinal products. The MHRA's first priority is safety, with a core focus at all times on the balance of benefits and risks of a medicinal product or vaccine. As already stated by others, no medical product is completely risk-free. All have the potential to cause side effects. This module will examine the benefit-risk decision-making by the agency, in particular through clinical trials and the data which was obtained. Medicinal products are authorised by the MHRA with a requirement that manufacturers operate a robust post-authorisation surveillance system, through which the benefit-risk balance can be revised as real-world data becomes available and as clinical usage expands. A feature of the post-marketing surveillance is the yellow card scheme to which others have referred. The inquiry will hear evidence about the yellow card scheme and the understanding of the adverse reaction associated with particular vaccines. The inquiry will consider in particular how the MHRA detected, evaluated and responded to the risk of thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome associated with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the risk of myocarditis and pericarditis associated in particular with mRNA vaccines. My lady, the MHRA seeks to be an organisation which learns and improves through that learning. It recognises the importance of external scrutiny, especially in the context of vaccination, where misunderstanding, misinformation or disinformation are prevalent. It seeks to act transparently and, for example, during the pandemic, published vaccine safety updates and information to keep the public and healthcare professionals informed. Little could be more corrosive to public confidence in vaccines and other medicinal products as secrecy or obfuscation. The MHRA comes to this inquiry with a willingness to assist in establishing the facts and to enable lessons to be learned, so that it can continue to strengthen its systems and processes, particularly in the likely event of a future pandemic. My lady, those are our opening submissions.
Thank you very much indeed for your help, Mr Dixie. Very well, I think that probably is sufficient for today. Sorry about that, Mr Mingo. You'll be on first thing tomorrow, I promise. In which case, that'll be Mr Mingo at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you, my lady.
All right.